Hello, welcome to Story Elixir. This is a continuation of the analysis series I'm doing on Persona 5. If you haven't watched the first 2 episodes, the playlist is in the top right corner. I'll refer to the others every once in a while, so it'll be good to kind of watch these in order. Last time I jumped around a lot between the scenes and ideas because there was a lot of setup and things just generally worked better when grouped together. This time, however, the writers have fully settled into a plot-driven style, and plot is better discussed in a more linear way generally. Atlas games especially prioritize their plot and their themes over their characters. That's one of the main differences between them and, say, a Square Enix game. Because of this narrative approach, the writers have made some adjustments to specifically Ryuji and An the moment their arcs were finished to better serve narrative needs throughout the game instead of characterization needs like a Square Enix game would. The first adjustment they make is changing Ryuji's motivation from kind of that delinquent style, stick it to the man, we're gonna get back at society goal, to him wanting fame and recognition by being this phantom thief, this being of justice. This change happens with no setup, no foreshadowing. They just kind of yank his character into the shape they want him to be. However, they still have him say things that would align with his original motives.
Why do you do such things?
It's to get back at scumbags and, like, society in general.
Even though when he's not saying those kind of things, it's all about the recognition and the fame.
If we can take care of 2 or 3 famous guys, people will have to believe we exist.
The result is an overall weak character, at least in terms of writing, and it generally makes him also less likable. And they've already written characters with this kind of motivation in previous Persona games, so it's a little odd they struggled with Ryuji here, but they do. The second main adjustment they made has less impact, but it's still worth noting. They added that An also has trouble in school like Ryuji, except for English just because she's bilingual. This mostly shows up in her confidant links, where they just go right ahead and make her extremely dumb and extremely airheaded. But it is worth noting that they do kind of slide her into that blonde bimbo stereotype that's all over the place. Turning characters into stereotypes flattens them out so you can focus on someone else in the writing. And flat characters are easier to write, but doing that to characters with a character arc or they're already firmly established can either pull them out of character or it can cheapen the character arc they've already had, which is more what happens to An here. The last adjustment they made is specifically to the relationship between Ryuji and Morgana. The established relationship, once they kind of settled into the Kamoshida arc, was basically just them calling each other stupid for various things. However, all of a sudden, again, without any kind of setup or foreshadowing, they escalate this relationship by suddenly having Ryuji like kind of pick at whether or not Morgana is a human in cat form. And this is something that Morgana truly believes. So it's a sore spot. Going from just saying, haha, how dumb, to I'm gonna pick at your core belief system is a definite escalation, and it makes Ryuji seem kind of mean-spirited with his jokes. Like, you don't tend to go after someone's deep-seated insecurities, and so this makes him less likable also. They just generally make him less likable across the board. It is almost certainly in service to a plot event that happens arcs from now as setup. And in the meantime, it adds some cheap character drama between Ryuji and Morgana. But it sacrifices a lot of that really solid characterization I went over in the Kamoshida video. This is a good time to go over how characters typically function in groups within a story. Characters typically don't work well if you make them kind of in a vacuum all by themselves. They generally exist in what's known as a character web, which is having this character be this other person's boyfriend, and then at the same time be this other third character's like best friend. And these kind of things all kind of link up together in interesting ways. That's why it's called a web, because it links up in a web-like structure. But generally, because of this structure, messing with one character or one relationship affects any other part of the character web that interacts with this character or this relationship. So if a writer doesn't keep that in mind when they're writing characters, You could have a character kind of make it all fall to pieces or break someone's immersion by acting way out of character, or something of this nature. Some writers try to avoid this by making their characters in a vacuum, which is one of the easiest ways to kind of fall into that Mary Sue trope, where a character is just OP because reasons, and those reasons are never explained. The other way writers tend to solve this problem is they write the character web first and make the plot kind of form around those characters. That's more common in today's media. In Persona 5, the trio of Ryuji, An, and Morgana make up the core, the center of this character web, so adjusting them affects most of the story. As you can kind of tell, the choices a writer makes deeply affect the characters and the story in a multitude of ways, and those choices are kind of informed by their own beliefs and biases. It's why having more than one writer on a project can derail an entire project, because the two writers may not have the same beliefs or goals, and it's also why character inconsistencies kind of need to be noted and have some attention on them. Making Ryuji a dumb, mean-spirited delinquent who lacks a future because he was only good at track and then got his leg broken doesn't just tell us about Ryuji. It also tells us how at least one of the writers feels about people who don't necessarily fit into that model student kind of mold. Anyway, on to the plot itself. We start kind of in a transition period between arcs because our little group here isn't thinking about forming a group and doing this full time. All they wanted was to make the school abuse stop and to avoid getting expelled. Well, now they've done that, so they have no more reason to interact with the plot at all. They just want to get their money, celebrate, and go back to being regular people. It's a reasonable thing to want. The main character also meets Sae here in the narrative itself instead of just us in the interrogation room. Because of this, Sae has officially become an acting force in the narrative. She's going to be actually doing things now. Up until this point, she's mostly just been the commentator in the interrogation room with us, the player, and future character. The player knew that she was around and investigating the breakdowns, but the main character hadn't met her yet and didn't know anything about her, so she's largely not been there. Now that she's an active player in the plot, they're really quick to do a couple of things. First of all, they're establishing her main defining trait. She's extremely smart in a practical way. It's less book smarts and more logical deductions, more like Sherlock Holmes. She might also have book smarts, but they don't mention it because it's not important to the narrative. The important thing is that she makes the connection between one change of heart and the breakdowns that have been happening for, I guess, years, after only seeing it again one time. Morgana has mentioned that doing the change of heart incorrectly can cause a mental shutdown, so the player is probably suspecting that she's 100% right, that the two are similar. Take a moment to think about how amazing that is. She doesn't know about the metaverse. She doesn't know about personas, the mechanics of how any of the change of heart thing is done, none of it. But she does recognize that how Kamoshida's acting is similar enough to the people who have mental shutdowns act. She's able to draw that connection after only seeing it once and without knowing how it happened. However, she ain't some mastermind. She's not like L from Death Note. She doesn't know we did it. Likely this is a chance encounter. From her saying in that first video,
I didn't expect to be you.
And also now, she's just here having small talk at a coffee shop and just wanting coffee and asking,
Are you a part-timer? I'm surprised this place can afford one.
It's more likely that this is just her local coffee shop that she stops by to get her favorite drink. It's not likely that she came specifically because she thinks that we were a phantom thief. Sojiro leaves this serious conversation almost immediately. He's not engaging with it at all, but that character flaw is more important in a couple arcs from now, so I'll discuss it there. After that, we pawn the medal and go to the hotel for some good food, because yay, celebrations. The only really important parts here are how the people treat the party being here like they don't belong there, and running into the bald guy. He uses the same character model and the same voice as the drunk guy who got you into this mess, and they explicitly make the connection for you if the player hasn't noticed. Because of this, and because he's generally an ass, the player is likely going to assume that he will later be a target at some point. However, if you have an informed player who is familiar with the writing tropes they are using here, they're gonna know right here, this moment, that this guy is the main antagonist. If you don't want to be spoiled at all, for some reason, skip ahead to this time. Up until that point, I'm going to talk about the logical leaps that a player could reasonably make with the information we have right now, what's going on in a general sense. One, the really easy one, he's given a character portrait. So again, he's gonna be important, he's gonna be a target later. Two, he's tied to the main character's arc in a way no other character is or can be, which is almost exclusively given to the antagonist or the love interest. But this is a game where you can pick your love interest, so there's no way they could do that with how many options we have. And the last one, and the most important one, a common writing trope is that the main antagonist inadvertently brings about their own destruction or downfall, karmic justice and all that. In this guy's case, him suing the main character gets our boy into Tokyo and on the path to confronting Kamoshida and becoming a phantom thief. On its own, that's just backstory for our main character. It did not need to come back, it did not need to be important. However, he also sets the phantom thieves as a group on their path to continue changing hearts. This encounter in the hotel causes Ryuji to wonder if the trick of the whole change of heart thing can be repeated if multiple people have palaces, and the group decides to try and reform society because of this encounter and because of how the hotel people are treating the party. So if I use this guy being our main antagonist as a base, an informed player can make a few logical leaps here. You can deduce that as the main antagonist, he is in some way responsible for the mental shutdown we saw in April. In some way, we don't know. If you remember the details of the train accident from April, you can also start to wonder how the bald guy benefits from taking down a major rail company and the head of the Ministry of Transport, because they say in that scene that these two people were going down. So you can think that the bald guy's motivations are either economic because it's a major rail company and he may want to take out a competitor, or it's political because we're talking about the Ministry of Transport. Now, if you add in the corrupt SIU director into the whole mix that they just handed us in Kamoshida's arc for no benefit, and he's clearly in on it, it changes that question of which one of these two motivations could it be to an answer, because the SIU is clearly related to law enforcement because we know that Sae works for him, and she's a prosecutor, and she's interrogating us in that interrogation room. So you now have this one guy who possibly benefits from the Ministry of Transport going down, and he has the SIU director, which is related to law enforcement, on his payroll somehow. And suddenly, this is two sectors of the government that are being affected by the main antagonist in some way. Again, we don't know at this point, which means you take out the economic benefit because there's more benefit in terms of political aspirations. The guy's motivations are political in nature. Now, I've mentioned this a couple of times already, but it's really important to note this is not like a detailed blow by blow, this is how the story's gonna go. This is the shape of the plot coming into focus. However, this does highlight an issue that I mentioned previously with that scene in Kamoshida's arc with the SIU director. Did the writers really want an informed player to know this much about their main antagonist this early? They've kept it kind of under wraps, and it doesn't really seem like it because they're trying really hard to make the SIU director seem more nefarious and more evil. So it feels more like they wanted the bald guy to be a surprise villain later. If they wanted the bald guy to be a surprise, like I just said, the character should have run into the SIU director here, kind of telling people what to do instead of the bald guy. And if they wanted to better foreshadow the bald guy, then you don't need the scene with the SIU director in Kamoshida's arc. Because again, we have him being drunk at the beginning of the game, and we have the bald guy here. So he's already being foreshadowed. We're already good there. So I think them trying to make him a twist villain didn't quite work out because they added unnecessary exposition in the Kamoshida arc before he was even relevant to the story. Anyway, our group is formed, and we set the rules of this group before cutting back to talking with Sae in the interrogation room. This scene serves several purposes. The easiest is simply a reminder of where we are, what we're doing, and a minor story recap. Nice. Secondly, it's another opportunity to give Sae some characterization because, again, she is now a moving force in the plot and we need to get a characterization on her. They show that she is listening to what our character is saying, even though she doesn't believe it. And it's very clear she's like, you're crazy. But she does respond to what he says. And even though she doesn't believe it, she is respecting that he thinks that it's true at least. Another vitally important thing the player should notice is that no names are being used. Sae just calls them accomplices and has to ask you, hey, are these students at the same school? Now, we know she's right because she's good at this. We've already talked about this. But our character isn't even allowed to confirm. You're allowed to sass her. You're allowed to be quiet, but you're not allowed to be like, oh yeah, no, they're students at the same academy. There's no option for that. Our character is loyal to his friends. He's going down for this alone. And the player cannot change that about him in this conversation. Back inside the story within a story, we have a text conversation after the meal, and the player can already kind of see that the goals aren't quite aligned. On genuinely wants to help people find courage, while Ryuji talks about the fame and the recognition. When we go into the Velvet Room, Igor is more of the same, talking about rehabilitation and ruin without a truly clear explanation, even though he's like,
I shall explain it to you now.
He doesn't explain anything. We cut to the next day where Ryuji is bummed for some reason, even though it's been less than a day and he hasn't found a target yet. It's a little overstated, I would say. Like it's one day, man. Calm down. The scene with Makoto and the president is primarily set up for the next arc and Makoto's personal arc later. So I'm only going to briefly touch on it here just to kind of get us to where we need to go. They establish some key facts about her, like she's at the top of her class, she's well behaved. They drop her last name as Nijima, which we should recognize as Sae's last name, so you can tell they are related. And Sae is an adult, whereas Makoto is a teenager, so it's likely that they're sisters. And I think they also confirm it in the conversation. We're told that Sae is ambitious and accomplished at a pretty young age, which is implied to kind of put pressure on Makoto to do well to keep Sae's reputation untarnished, make Sae look good. The principal uses this fact as kind of a threat to get Makoto to investigate the Phantom Thieves for him, and they let the player know that he's calling someone, investigating for someone, working for someone. You could imply that it's someone we've met, but they don't really make it clear yet. And Makoto then does something odd. She confronts the party, and I'm kind of conflicted on that. Because on the one hand, it does show that she's pinned down who is responsible for what happened to Kamoshida in a matter of days, which does confirm that she can also logic out things like Sae can. Maybe at a slower speed, I don't know. They don't really give like a speed test, right? But she has the same thinking abilities. However, she confronts the party without evidence, without proof, and we know that someone in her family is related to law enforcement. Again, Sae works for the SIU director, so she would know better, right? Sort of like, or hell, watch a true crime show. It's always the evidence that matters. You could make the argument that she's not taking it seriously because, you know, she was threatened and also doesn't think it's worth her time. But even if that's the case, it's not a good tactic to take until you're sure, especially since she ends it by making enemies of the party. Like, don't make us mad without proof. We then go to the Mementos scenes, which are primarily world building and establishing Morgana's personal arc in a more concrete way. Like, he's mentioned a few times, like, oh, I need to get my body back, and oh, I need to get my memories back, and blah, blah, blah. But his arc is related to Mementos, and so they are more concretely connecting Mementos and Morgana. He also says that
Mementos is not just everyone's palace. It's the source of all palaces.
So the writers are hinting that the problem in this game is systemic rather than just a few bad actors doing dumb things. They refer to the collective unconscious because Mementos is a giant reference to Jung's theory on the subject. He believed that similar themes existed across cultures because of the existence of a shared consciousness across humanity. He made the distinction between the personal consciousness that like Freud thought of and the collective unconscious as like separate things. And he believed that it kind of encompassed the entire soul of humanity, so to speak. That's more his words, not mine. This idea led to the creation of character archetypes, which is the basis of so many characters in fiction. It's kind of insane. And they're really heavily prevalent in Japanese media, so that's why all that's going on. Side note, we get a cat bus reference, and I'm here for it. In Mementos, we confront Nakanohara, who gives us a name drop of our target, which officially starts the arc. He's a reminder of one of the core themes because he was a victim himself, and that caused his perception of reality to become warped, and society didn't protect him from that, which is one of the key themes of the game. And later on, he helps later as a plot device to confirm that Madarame is in fact a bad person and does deserve a change of heart when the party kind of goes, I don't know, is he really a bad person? Makoto then confronts the main character alone this time and confirms that she is following us around. It's still not smart. Makoto, you're smarter than this. After that, we get introduction to Yusuke, which is another fully animated scene, and I love the little touches here. They previously set it up by showing his character model after coming out of Mementos, and An mentioned in a conversation before this scene that she felt like she was being watched, but then we all dismissed it as, oh, I'm just used to being, in the metaverse where, there's shadows everywhere and we have to be vigilant. In the scene itself, despite the way Ryuji's kind of acting like he doesn't care and that he is making fun of her, he does start the scene behind An with our character in front of her. They're kind of flanking her and protecting her to make sure she's okay. And they kind of keep her between the two of them throughout the scene, even though the guys switched positions once. They also put themselves between An and the guy they don't really know when kind of confronting him. And in the scenes after the animated one, Ryuji will kind of step between Yusuke and An whenever Yusuke starts getting too pushy. On a narrative level, using An as bait here is technically an example of pre-scene foreshadowing, but that's kind of a treat for a second playthrough. Once you know what's going to happen, it's kind of cool, they did that. In terms of introducing Madarame, they used the exact same trick they used for Kamoshida. He's presented as just kind old man, like that's it. He's an old dude, that's nice. However, there's one twist this time. Because we have had conversations with Sae, and because we had the confrontation with Nakanohara, the player already knows that Madarame is our target, even though the characters don't. This one fact is needed to change the perception the player has upon meeting him, kind of better aligning the player with the characters as they try and figure out, hey, is this guy actually a bad person? Hey, is he a good person? Because we haven't seen anything yet, but we know he's our target. I'm going to take the time to hop around a little bit just to talk about how the scenes where An and Yusuke are the focal characters are constructed. Nearly all of them use and subvert common romance tropes for either comedic purposes or plot purposes or both.
You're the woman I've been searching for all this time. Please.
The scene here fully sounds like a love confession right up until he goes,
Be the model for my next art piece.
She agrees to go to the art exhibit with him, which is kind of joked about and construed as like a date, but she's going strictly to investigate Madarame. Then when she agrees to be the model for him, neither are there for like romantic reasons or for physical attraction, even though normally the love interest visiting your home is a sign that, the romance is proceeding well. It's a checklist thing on the romance tropes. And finally, they do the incredibly funny scene where she comes in with like 20 layers of clothing on, and we find out that he does find her attractive because he is physically affected by her taking off her clothes and her bad acting. But for her, it's just a ruse to get into that locked door. So they play around with specifically romance tropes when putting these two center stage, at least until Yusuke's arc is over. Anyway, back to the plot. One of my favorite things is that Sae cuts in here just to call out how implausible this all is.
You became acquainted with Madarame's pupil by chance?
And I love meta jokes like this when they don't distract from the plot, which this doesn't. This is a very good use of it. But they have her use the information she's been given as a basis for a theory, which demonstrates a couple of things. One, she's got a very flexible mind because you can't prove what you're saying, and let's be real, you sound crazy, but she's able to understand them and use them in a meaningful way right away. And two, even if just a little bit, she's beginning to believe what you tell her. And even then, only in a theoretical sense. She's not willing to believe that these things actually happened, but she's at least able to use the information and create a theory. You really get a sense of how she solves problems, which adds some depth to her character. Checking her watch is also a nice reminder that we are in fact still on a time limit. She has to keep track of time. When we get to the exhibit, it's mainly to establish a better baseline for Madarame's character outside of a palace. This is also different than Kamoshida because we learned about Kamoshida's shadow first and then met the real one. It maintains that ambiguity of whether the guy is a problem or if he's bad or what's going on as the characters try and wrestle with that same question, while still giving a couple of hints that there's some rotten underneath for the player to see. We get another of those hints based on how just overblown Yusuke's reaction is to the party even suggesting that Madarame might be a bad egg. There's a sense of desperation to it, he's covering. And that's of course confirmed when we learn that Madarame does have a palace. Just like Kamoshida, Madarame's palace is all about how he thinks about the people in his life and how he views the world in general. All of his pupils are represented as artwork, as paintings, which is his main source of income. These pupils are not valued as people. He's turned them into objects. They're a resource to be used and then discarded when they no longer produce results, which they say. He believes that people don't care about authenticity, so he manufactures situations to artificially inflate the price of his art using lies and tricks and misinformation. This extends to how he presents himself as well, to the point where he's assigned the sin of vanity, which does specifically talk about excessive pride in relation to one's appearance. He wants people to think that he's humble and unconcerned with material wealth, even though, no, that's what he values above all else. His palace is gold and flashy. The characters even call it gaudy and repulsive. My favorite line that kind of fully encapsulates the point of his palace is,
Madarame created with his own funds.
Madarame believes that paying for the art he steals via his pupils' housing and food is the same as him being the creator of the artwork himself, which is not true. He didn't physically make it, the pupil did. He does say that he didn't want to return to the life of a struggling artist when you defeat his shadow, which vaguely hints at a past plagued by money troubles. However, it's a lot less defined than Kamoshida's was, so it's a lot harder to get a sense of what he was like and how his life may have been before he became what we see him as now. On a more meta, above narrative level, Madarame represents a common issue in Japan regarding plagiarism because many people want to replicate the look and feel of anime or the way illustrations work in manga. Plagiarism is extremely common. They even have the word, I think it's a torepaku for it, which is a combination of the Japanese pronunciation of the word tracing and the word pakuri, which roughly translates to copying. The developers are kind of shining a giant spotlight on this issue and saying, look, this is an issue. After investigating the palace a little, we get another scene of Makoto snooping around, but she's going to mainly take a back seat now that the actual arc is going and in full swing. The scene with Yusuke during the modeling is nice because this arc is better written strictly in terms of adding that moral ambiguity I talked about them wanting to have in the Kamoshida video. Yusuke defends his master and points out that he does not want us around, nor did he ask for help. In fact, he finds us to be a bother. So trying to help him is more for the characters to feel like heroes rather than because someone needs to be saved. It's really too bad all of this is completely thrown out the moment there's an opportunity to make On a sex object again. If you factor in the fact that Yusuke is using coercion to do it, makes the entire idea of On being his nude model extremely creepy. And that's on top of my previous criticisms about how they continue to degrade this victim of sexual harassment, and she's still extremely clear about how she is not okay with how she's being treated. They even reference her experience with Kamoshida, reminding the player and planting a giant flag saying, what happened to On is really bad. There's so much like whiplash with this character because they're simultaneously saying it's okay to treat this character like sexual eye candy, both in and out of the game, while also saying, remember Kamoshida, the guy who wanted nothing more but to get this teenager alone so he could basically assault her? He was real bad, wasn't he? You should sympathize with her. It's wild. Pick a side. Hopefully, the side that respects her as a character. Anyway, I should move along. The reporter is introduced to set up a plot event in the next arc, so I'm gonna go over that when we get there. In terms of palace progression, I like the idea that changing how the target sees the world in small ways also affects how you can progress in the palace. I understand people tend to like clearing a dungeon in only one day to maximize free time. Hell, I do it, but it's a nice touch and it leans into the whole cognition thing they're going for this time. Also, despite my complaints about the events that led to the scene of her wearing, the gazillion clothes and stripping them one by one, is very funny. It's my favorite thing in this arc. And her bad acting skills is also quite funny. It's a highlight. This does give us our first concrete example that Yusuke does in fact lie. Often. Because he does find On attractive as a member of the opposite sex, as he put it, but told everyone he didn't. This wouldn't have worked if he was being honest about not being attracted to On, because her disrobing wouldn't affect him, her bad acting wouldn't have affected him. He just would have been very firm about, no, you have to stay in this room. And then they get just dropped into the palace, and Madarame's shadow confirms to both Yusuke and the player that he is in fact actually really awful, as we suspected. And we get Yusuke's persona awakening, which always looks nice. I really like the addition of Yusuke apologizing for his earlier behavior though. One, because again, it was very creepy. And two, you don't usually get to see an official apology in fiction because normally a writer will go for karmic punishment instead. So they don't normally have to then show remorse. Now, you're probably wondering why I haven't really talked about Yusuke as a character that much. I've mentioned him as part of plot, but I haven't mentioned a character arc. I haven't mentioned how he acts. I haven't mentioned a baseline for his characterization. To do that, I need to mention something fundamental about fictional characters. Characters in stories are not real. They're not real people. They exist to serve a function within the confines of their universe. They move the plot forward, they represent character traits they display, they find their place in the setting and let the player kind of come along for the ride, or they interact with and are sometimes mouthpieces for the plot's themes. Villains are normally a belief system that is taken to its most logical extreme. Heroes are usually the embodiment of what the writer believes is the answer to that extreme that the villain represents. Which character is given more prominence, or rises in power, or defeats their enemies, and which ones don't, is also a statement the writer is making. No matter how relatable, sympathetic, or lovable a character may be or may not be, they should always serve a purpose in the story. Now, does this mean you can't relate to, or sympathize with, or love your favorite characters? No, of course not. That would be dumb. In fact, the best characters make you forget that. They make you fully invest in their journey, and maybe you're gonna cry along the way because they did a really good job. So what does this have to do with Yusuke? His main purpose within the narrative is to help answer a thematic question. By himself is not a character. He's a thematic extreme. He and Madarame both serve as ideological extremes at either end of this question and are thematic foils to each other. How important should the pursuit of wealth be to an artist in relation to their art? On its face, this is an incredibly easy answer. Artists train up a skill and create their own style in that skill for years. They should be rewarded for those years of dedication to their craft. They should be able to afford, to live off of their trade. There's no reason why they should not be paid for services rendered if someone wants to commission their art. It's not much different than hiring an electrician to wire up a house. However, there are complications to factor into this argument that muddy the waters. For one, the impact art has on society in general is cultural rather than practical. Like, yes, the picture on the wall is very pretty, but it doesn't support the wall. It's a pretty thing on top of the wall. So it's difficult to see the value of individual artistic expression while living within any specific art movement. That kind of thing is usually analyzed and categorized later with the benefit of hindsight and the ability to see trends across multiple years, across multiple individuals. Another complicating factor is that there are pieces of art worth an extraordinary amount of money because of how the art industry works, and due to the scarcity of that art piece, it changes depending on what art piece we're talking about. The last major thing that I personally know exists relates back to art not normally having a immediate tangible impact on the world. There are plenty of benefits to pursuing commissioning and having art, but good luck convincing people of that. I am not an artist, so I suggest chatting with one and getting their experiences. They may have a different experience than mine, but a reason I am not an artist is because my family believed that I could never make a living as someone who pursued something artistic in nature, regardless of my skill at that thing. And they adjusted my life so that I wouldn't interact with artistic things very much until I was able to be an adult, move out of the house, and be away from that controlling influence. For example, as a student, my legal guardian could sign me up for classes they wanted me to take, even if I, the actual student, protested. Even now, me doing the YouTube thing receives no familial support in any form, and is actively compared to me just playing around, despite the fact that I am in fact putting a lot of work and effort and passion into it. Yes, making videos is not the same thing as being an artist who makes art, but their response is similar to when I wanted to try and do artistic things earlier in life. So my experience is a kind of a microcosm of the general sentiment around art and artists. If it doesn't make money, why do it? Why buy art? It's a waste of money. It doesn't do anything. How can I profit from art without putting in the actual work? There are people who think that artists should just work for free. And there are others who believe that artists wanting money to pay their bills somehow corrupts their art or makes it less authentic. And what? So the question of whether or not artists should pursue wealth is actually kind of tricky based on these factors and probably a million others that I just don't know about. Like, I'm sure the cost of art supplies is factored in somewhere in there. Madarame clearly represents the extreme that art should just be an avenue to acquire wealth. So he has no qualms about stealing or altering other people's art. He is completely okay with creating artificial scarcity or manufacturing elaborate backstories to inflate the value of his pieces. The player is meant to disagree with this idea because he's the villain in this arc. Like Kamoshida before him, you shouldn't look at a guy who intentionally let a woman die so he could take credit for her work and think, I want to be just like him. What? No. Yusuke, however, is the other extreme. He believes that you should enjoy art purely for its own sake. He wants to pursue art even though he knew deep down that he was being used and mistreated by his mentor. By going after Madarame, he sacrificed his secure lodgings and food without any backup plan in place. He only cares about making art he feels good about. On top of being these nice thematic extremes I'm talking about, these two characters are also similar to each other. They both lie and coerce people, but for different reasons. Madarame is for profit, and for Yusuke it's to get a model for his art. When confronted with truths, they both used another neutral third party to try threatening the party or making them go away. Yusuke threatened to call the police when we confront him about the Madarame thing, and Madarame wanted to press charges. That's what gets us to go after him more by himself instead of just because of Yusuke. Finally, they are both deeply affected by the Sayuri painting. However, it warped Madarame into what we see, while it inspired Yusuke to be an artist in the first place. The player will most likely fall somewhere in the middle of these two views, and that's okay. We've got a plot to get back to anyway. We get through the palace, and we receive our confession reward later. An interesting note is that both the brown-haired kid that the player has seen talking with Sae and Makoto both say the same things, and they both leave out of screen, but they move in opposite directions. They don't both go left, they don't both go right. They go in different directions. This visual trick is often used to denote that these two characters are similar. However, they are usually different in like one key way, or maybe two key ways. They usually have either different motivations, they have different methods, or both, but they think alike. They're being set up to be foils for each other later. And that's the Madarame arc. This one was kind of long, so thank you for your patience in waiting for it to come out. If you're enjoying the deep dive, please give the video a like, and if you're interested in more, go ahead and subscribe. These will come out every time I finish playing through an arc in the playthrough, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!